Great showing of undergrads and graduate
Lovely to
students.
see these boxes. familiar faces and names. So.
Oh, did we ask if, are you all right, Professor Black, if we go ahead and record?
Yes, that
Right.
is more than fine. That's good.
There's David.
Yes. You're muted, David.
You're still muted. And there's John Larson.
I have a background from my college days somewhere. That's my college friends.
Oh,
but I don't know why that's there. So hi, Megan.
Hi. Good to see you and all of your friends.
Yeah, really.
And do you mean to look like
a way to?
Do you mean to have the cat filter on as well, Professor Atkinson?
Oh wow, my daughter's been playing with this clearly, huh? I think we'll just stop the video.
We know you're there, so.
Well, I'm wondering the best time to do this, and I actually think it might be now. I wonder if I could impose on everyone to kind of hello. I'm wondering if I could impose on everyone to turn on their cameras. You don't have to leave it on for long, just for a moment, but I would like to take a photo of everyone who's assembled just to sort of commemorate the event. So if you're comfortable turning on your camera just for a moment, that would be, I know everyone has Zoom fatigue, but thank you. All right, we're getting close to critical mass. All right, I'm about to take the photo. Smile, everyone. Thank you. And we might do another one at the end, depending on the composition of the audience. So my name is Fritz Davis. I'm professor and head of the Department of History here at Purdue University. And it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker. But before we should do that, I should mention that the event is sponsored by the Department of History at Purdue and the R. Mark Lovers Chair in the History of Science. It is also part of Environmental History Week, which is serving in lieu of the annual conference of the American Society for Environmental History. And it's really wonderful to see such a great mix of faculty and graduate students here at Purdue and old friends and new friends from environmental history. Tonight's speaker is Megan A. Black, and she is Associate Professor of History at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She's an historian of US environmental management and foreign relations in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Professor Black is the author of The Global Interior, Mining Frontiers and American Power, which is her subject this evening. The book is particularly appropriate since it appeared on the reading list in at least 2 graduate seminars here at Purdue last fall. Professor David Atkinson featured the book in his course on transnational history, and I also used it in mine on environmental history. Moreover, this work garnered 4 prizes in different subfields, including the George Perkins Marsh Prize from ASEH, the Stewart Albernath Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, or SHAFR, the W. Turrentine Jackson Prize from the Western History Association, and the British Association of American Studies Prize. Professor Black has published articles and review essays in the Journal of American History, Modern American History, Diplomatic History, and American Quarterly. Her new manuscript is tentatively titled Short Circuiting Extraction, and it will explore anti-mining campaigns in the global 1970s. Professor Black previously taught in the Department of International History at the London School of Economics, and she received her doctorate at Georgetown University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Megan Black.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fritz, for that lovely introduction. And it is such a pleasure to get to visit with you all today and be a part of this programming for environmental history, for ASEH. It's wonderful to see the community coming together. I should say, kind of scaling back, I'm overwhelmed by the boxes on the screen, in part because it's just lovely to see so many friends and colleagues that I've learned from but never had the chance to meet. I'm delighted. For instance, I was lucky to do some research for the book that became The Global Interior alongside John Larson at the Charles Warren Center, and other colleagues, and I have crossed paths, David Atkinson, Zoe Misa, who's in the anthropology department. I've just been very overjoyed to know people in your community. And yes, I really look forward to comments and questions. So before we begin, obviously we're tuning in from many different locations and assembling on different historically situated grounds. So I want to reflect on and recognize the peoples who for millennia stewarded the lands where I am in Arlington, Massachusetts, the Wampanoag people. And I'm thinking a lot in the last few weeks and months in light of new research that has been produced by Robert Lee and Tristan Natone about MIT's role as a land-grant institution in having foundational wealth wrung from the sale of lands belonging to Indigenous peoples across the continent. And these are things that I know many universities are grappling with, and they're also processes that connect with the history of the US Department of the Interior, though we're by no means fully determined by them. And so with that, I'm going to pull up some slides that will allow us to think about the Interior Department, but in a slightly different context than is often the case in literature. So to begin, I will start with a story. In February of 1967, the US Secretary of the Interior, Stewart Udal, and his signature bolo tie, embarked on a 2-week journey across the Middle East. The tour included a stopover in Saudi Arabia that at first seemed far afield from the American West, where Udal, a politician from Arizona, had famously overseen a variety of land use projects, from hydroelectric dams to wildlife refuges. And although his stated purpose in the Middle East was to discuss the seemingly apolitical topic of environmental management, including national park creation, he simultaneously undertook activities that the international community had come to see as being deeply political, those dealing with US mineral interests abroad. His main purpose in Saudi Arabia, for example, was to investigate and smooth over the highly charged oil situation under King Faisal, who Udal referred to as that old camel raider. And Arab news media suspected that this was Udal's purpose and charged him with manipulating the oil economy. To refute these accusations, he insisted with a kind of characteristic modesty that he was just, quote, an innocent minister of the interior who should be called Minister of Natural Resources. And the implication, he seemed to think, was very clear, which is that, there was an implicit question: what could he, or the Interior Department for that matter, have to do with the politics of the world? So I know that many of you thankfully have read and engaged with this work, for which I'm so grateful in your seminars and other contexts. So you know that I start my book project, or my book, with that story. I quickly answer the question, what could he have to do with the politics of the world, by claiming that the Interior Department actually had far more to do with the politics of the world than has been previously allowed. So today we know the Interior Department is an arm of the US government that is known for managing natural resources in the nation's parks, as well as supervising Native American affairs. And its remit in environmental management, by which I'll be referring to a kind of federal governance overseeing natural resources and environmental well-being, is widely understood to be confined to the home. However, in the 20th century, the Interior Department oversaw a quest for minerals that entered into an array of seemingly disparate zones, including American Indian lands, but also formal US territories, foreign nations, the oceans, and outer space. And contrary to conventional wisdom, in short, the Interior Department operated in a global field. I often use the figure of Stewart Udal to help quickly constellate that field. And so today I'll do the same, suggesting that he can serve as a kind of tour guide through this expanding sphere of Interior's jurisdiction. So he would not only venture to the Middle East, but would also supervise Indian affairs, as seen here in a photo op with a Navajo elder at the dedication of a coal-fired power plant on the reservation. He would oversee territorial affairs in places like Guam and Samoa because US territories had fallen under Interior's jurisdiction since the New Deal. He would undertake diplomatic missions to Africa, Asia, and Latin America, here depicted in Santiago, Chile, where Interior had supervised natural resource programs since the earliest days of international development. And we see the bolo tie once again made the trip. He would also oversee the management and exploration and leasing of the continental shelf, which added to Interior's jurisdiction a mineral-rich territory nearly the size of the Louisiana Purchase, albeit underwater. Here we see Udal looking casual on a boat off the coast of Puerto Rico, which had also been under its jurisdiction. And he would advance a space exploration agenda that involved both a colorful attempt to mine the moon and, more consequentially, in my view, the creation of a satellite Landsat that could view Earth's resources. And here we see Udal at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, and he chose this place to just go for the standard black tie, which is something that I'm curious about. And broadly, I think there is a project somewhere about the sartorial style of Stewart Udal. So what do we make of this kind of tour? On some level, we could see it as the amusing but ultimately insignificant travels of a self-styled cowboy diplomat, or as a seemingly benign export of American values and technical modernity overseas. But I argue in the book that we actually have to see it as a kind of institutional linkage between US processes of settler colonial expansion and the projection of American power beyond those continental borders as well. And with that power, I mean US government institutions, capitalist interests, and ecological tolls. So I want to proceed today as follows. I will chart the two key coordinates of my research horizon for you, detailing how this book contributes to interconnected fields of environmental history and the history of the US and the world. And I'll advance a key argument of the global interior that this arm of the US government institutionalized a skill set that had been cultivated and gradually across the 19th century, and the processes central to that had been westward expansion, and that this skill set evolved into environmental management, which in turn became, in ways that are less surprising when you see this original expansionist history, very useful to the project of extending American personnel and procedures beyond borders in the 20th century. So in the second section, I'll argue that ideas about non-human nature help to justify US intervention in a world marked by increasing commitments to anti-imperialism. And the observation that nature was borderless, for instance, helped to rationalize border crossings on the path to a global project of extraction. And I'll draw on material that spans the book, but we'll really try to burrow in on a chapter that looks at the Interior Department's involvements in international development in the 1950s through what was known as President Harry S. Truman's Point 4 program, that later became the US Agency for International Development, or USAID. And in later chapters, I show how actually in an extreme example of development, the Interior Department's part in the creation of a satellite would be really important to natural resource programs and prospecting minerals in those regions. So there are some through lines that I'll try to signal as well. And throughout, I will suggest that these histories show how expansionism is at the heart of what we often see as being totally urgent and necessary, and I agree that it is, which is environmental governance and management. But what we see is that the flip side of conservation at home has often been the extraction of resources elsewhere and out of sight, and that this often came at the expense of racialized labor forces and in foreign landscapes, or zones beyond US sovereignty. These histories, in turn, I hope, have lessons for the pursuit of environmental justice in an age of anthropogenic climate change that perhaps we as a group can think about further in the Q&A. So, part one. I want to begin by contemplating how the Interior Department came to play what I see as an indispensable role in America's expansive unfolding. And another way of framing the problem is to ask simply, how did this department get a global portfolio? Well, this apparent paradox of interior people and exterior places is actually what animated me in graduate school and set me off on this dissertation process many years ago. In the archive, I noticed that interior personnel were trading in assignments in the US for those scattered across places like Afghanistan and beyond as part of international development. And this seemed initially like a contradiction. What was interior doing exterior? Until early on, I encountered a speech by one interior official that seemed to square the circle. He said that far from being a contradiction, the Interior Department was naturally involved in continuing processes it had overseen for a century at home. So I'll flag this speech, which was given actually on United Nations Day in 1951 by Vernon Northrop, the Assistant Secretary of the Interior. And he pointed to the department's history managing what he labels the frontier in US history. And so here we can quote him. Once it was the undeveloped West of the 1850s, which constituted a primary reason for the establishment of this department and conditioned its development. Now it is the underdeveloped areas of the free world of the 1950s. And he concluded that Interior had this special know-how or skill set needed to help bring about the opening of this new frontier. So sources like Northrop challenged me and helped me to see that it was not so strange that the Interior Department was at the forefront of US expansion. Rather, the fact that it appeared to me as strange was itself the problem that needed to be investigated. So as I dealt with this problem, people like Northrop pushed me further back in time, beyond my comfort zone, certainly, to the very origins of the department in the wake of the US war with Mexico, a journey that revealed that Interior had in important ways always been pushing exterior. The department had been born on March 3rd, 1849, to oversee America's continental expansion at a time when the fledgling federal government struggled to keep pace with rapid transformations, including the proliferation of land claims in California following the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill, an event that we know culminated in a genocide against California Indians. Interior employees trailed behind the US Army, and they worked to incorporate expropriated land into the national fold, preparing it for capitalist utilization and settlement in different ways. And they were certainly joined by other institutions like the railroad corporations. And in the process of discharging this duty, were often accused of and guilty of great incompetence. But these agents, first for local fees and later for salaries, undertook day-to-day activities that were important to subordinating terrain and to trying to subordinate indigenous nations with prior claims to it through processes like surveying, parceling, codifying, disposing, settling, and utilizing land. In other words, they facilitated important processes that someone like Frederick Jackson Turner would later look back on and cite as having helped to close the American frontier, which is that category. The F word, as Patricia Nelson Limerick has said, it's a highly charged category and a fraught one in US history, and is one grappled with in many fields that I claim as part of my own, where Turner saw an origin of American democracy. Scholars hailing from the Wisconsin School and American Studies saw a dynamo propelling American overseas interventions in a 20th century context through different material and symbolic processes tied to the frontier. Meanwhile, US environmental historians found other significance. Its invitation to bring the material landscape from the background to the foreground of American history. And in this vein, Donald Worster illuminated the centrality of federal drives to conquer nature and as part of nation building. And this was a process especially evident in the creation of a network of dams meant to transform the arid West into a small patchwork of farms in keeping with a Jeffersonian ideal. And here I'll suggest we see this kind of romanticized and sanitized past in a mural that actually hangs in the Interior Department building. It's something that gives little indication of the dispossessions, the asymmetries in who could access water, or the spectacular failures that accompanied this attempt to alter climatic realities. Others have since challenged the tidiness of the line, the frontier, on the map entirely in wonderful ways, pushing against its binaristic logic and insisting instead upon the real hybridity that has characterized interconnected zones and webs of human and non-human assemblages. So this literature that I've described, falling between the study of US empire and environmental studies, forms the critical foundation from which my work builds. And within that, I try to index in particular the department's incessant drive outward, arguing that processes associated with the frontier, institutional protocols, were important to overseeing the expropriation of land on a vast geographic scale. That is what the term settler colonialism can do for us, even with its totalizing blind spots. And that this expropriation and process conditioned a skill set of knowledge that has underpinned what often appears exclusively as a neutral form of management of nature in a 20th century context. First in the renowned conservation platform, and then in its in more environmentalist actions in the 20th century. So this know-how would be directed to new projects of US global reach. Within the multifaceted world of nature, I see minerals as becoming singularly important, in part because of their increasing value to industrial society, and in part because of another arm of government that was good at taking control over biological resources, the US Department of Agriculture, incidentally spun from Interior in the 1860s. But I also see minerals mattering in that they provided new thresholds to pursue, those that were less defined by territory and more defined by physicality or physical limits. Over and over again, this task fell on Interior through bureaus like the Geological Survey and Bureau of Mines to pursue these limits. Hence, in 1899, after the supposed close of the frontier, the United States, in its imperial projection overseas in the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, among other places, we see Interior officials venturing to those zones to survey for minerals and promote capital investment on the ground, very explicitly. The department continued these tasks in new zones, and this is where I see a chance to connect to a century later, after its origin story, and the 1950s, a post-colonial world that Vernon Northrop described and insisted was directly related to what had happened before. So Northrop was referring to a set of activities under President Truman's Point Four program, a foreign policy that extended US scientific and technical expertise to the so-called backward areas of the world. It was a key launchpad for American modernization and development that overtly sought to bring about social improvement, not outside exploitation, right? This was exactly the claim Truman made. The old imperialism, exploitation for profit, has no place in our plans. But there was one problem, which was that US officials still desired access to things that were closely associated with imperialism, and that includes access and differential access to raw materials. As part of ongoing Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, the US used well-documented tactics to secure strategic resources. And in only the most notorious case, we see this as the US CIA helped to orchestrate a coup that ousted Iran's popularly elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, in 1953, because he denied the United States and Great Britain access to oil. And such interventions have drawn just scrutiny in foreign relations history. But part of what I attend to is how the US also relied on inconspicuous efforts like those of the Interior Department to achieve similar extractive ends in international development. So Interior technicians embedded in places like Iran, Afghanistan, Colombia, Philippines, and Egypt drew explicitly on experiences from the American West, what was then the American West, And they use that to help unearth minerals in new contexts. Their efforts revolved around a familiar and evolving set of procedures. So if we take one example, in a mission to Peru, the geologist George Erickson, who is from Butte, Montana, an epicenter of the famous Berkeley pit, would ultimately transfer that skill set to a new zone in which he enlisted what he described as native camp hands, loaded his burros with measuring instruments on a path to mapping rich lead, iron, tungsten, copper, and zinc deposits. And the reports that he compiled in turn were disseminated widely within the United States to interested parties, including private industries, as a kind of advertisement. Alongside strategic mineral surveys, they undertook other procedures that I was really interested in, which you can see here at the top of this table. They would use increasingly sophisticated methods, such as laboratory analytics, to determine the grade of minerals such as manganese, which was an element crucial to the production of steel. They would then send these samples back on cargo ships to Bureau of Mines facilities in, say, Denver or Salt Lake City. And these were not uniformly implemented across borders, as you see here. There were particularities that make sense given different political, cultural, geographic, geologic realities. But slowly and painstakingly, interior officials helped to do important spade work for the extension of a kind of extractive capitalism beyond borders, helping companies like National Lead Company in Mexico or Texas Gulf Sulfur Company and Standard Oil in Egypt. And at the same time, interior personnel in Point 4 also consciously drew on methods in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And we see this in the mission to Iran, which was the site of that famous coup that I've mentioned. In the prelude to that event, the Point 4 agenda in Iran was overseen by William E. Warren, who we see on the cover of his memoir. And Warren had a background in reclamation in California. As assistant secretary, he also oversaw numerous education agendas in public health agendas in reservations like Navajo reservation. After leaving his Washington, D.C. desk job in 1951 for Tehran, he explained to interior officials operating in what he called exterior places that they were to, quote, apply techniques proved valuable in the Indian service to encourage isolated peoples to adopt modern methods in their work and to utilize their resources to their own best possible advantage. The resource most central, in his estimation, was oil. He argued that Mossadegh's move to expropriate oil had been an act of fanatical nationalism and a tremendous failure to understand oil's value. After the overthrow of Mossadegh, Warren expressed relief with this obstinate ruler out of the way. He could focus on doing his job. He could help to implement new geological surveys and organize a new petroleum industry, helping to open up resource investments in Iran. He was one of many actors, but he was quite proud of this. So for these mineral agendas to unfold under the Point 4 program, which was claiming to be the opposite of imperialism, poses an ethical problem. And this is because in the context of post-war decolonization, outside exploitation of minerals had become a key symbol of imperialist exploitation. And numerous interior officials expressed a desire not to be associated with the arch villains such as Cecil Rhodes in Southern Africa or the Belgian regime in Congo. They also, however, admitted that what they wanted in Point 4 was a continuation of differential access to minerals. So W.D. Johnston, an Interior Foreign Minerals official, privately admitted that mineral programs would not help foreign nations in the long run. This was because the capital-intensive process relied on outside investors and siphoned profits away from participating nations. Their value, he conceded, was in US strategic interests. Yet most interior personnel beyond Johnston were true believers. And this is an important part of the story. I want to talk about their role as technicians, as well-meaning and well-intentioned actors and agents of US power who were very convinced of the benevolence of their project. So I'm curious to know, though, how did a dynamic so closely associated with the old imperialism manage to appear for many, to mark a departure from the old imperialism? And that's a contradiction that pushes us to the second section, which invites us to think about the ideas that are really important to the Interior Department's activities, the justifications. So in promoting Interior's mineral programs and international development, officials put forward this vision, like we see represented in this quote that I'll discuss, of a borderless nature that required American experts to cross borders for global and environmental good. And we see this if we return to Northrop on United Nations Day. Natural resources, land, water, and minerals know no national boundaries. Like Earth, of which they are a part, they are global. This observation implied, was explicit, that resources belong to all, an ideology that I call resource globalism, that in turn helped alleviate this problem of borders. National borders had become deeply politicized in 1945 with the founding of the United Nations, which is the event that occasioned this whole speech in the first place. And that was because the UN upheld borders and self-determination. Ideas about nature in this sense helped Interior and others downplay political borders, but selectively and when in US interests. The desire is readily apparent in the cover of Resources for Freedom, an influential report on post-war resource scarcity that Interior made important contributions to. And I'll say that, when I saw this image, which you might know is now part of the cover of the book, I was really struck by the absences on this globe. Absent is not only nations and national borders and nation states, but continents don't even appear. What we see instead is an orb that is suspended by a grid that features non-human nature, natural resources, infrastructure. We see hydroelectric dams, atomic energy facilities, oil derricks, mining and refining sites. And the implication is that natural resources are what matter, while national sovereignty is immaterial. Interior officials reasoned certainly that resources belong to all and should be developed by experts for all, but their claims also betrayed unilateral ambitions. And so we can read the same image of global resources as something that deterritorializes the American interior and just projects it onto a global screen. And this leads me to a second argument in a US environmental history that is increasingly going global, because many US officials in the post-war era cited nature as a means to justify an expansive US power. Ideas about nature had long been important to US expansionism. We can cite earlier settler colonial rationales for seizing land on grounds that indigenous populations misused it. And I'll say that in post-war internationalism, I certainly see echoes of this in something I call resource primitivism, the idea that primitive people misunderstood the value of natural resources and thus needed assistance. Yet these ideas, rooted in the seemingly obvious claim that nature was borderless, also offered a more neutral ground for intervention. And it was particularly useful because intermingling with the idea that nature was borderless was the insistence that nature was apolitical. And it was this commitment to the binary between politics and nature that kind of brings us full circle to Stewart Udal and his kind of shirking any kind of political responsibility, making a plea of political innocence in Saudi Arabia on grounds that he was merely a minister of natural resources, right? The either or, and much scholarship has refuted this boundary work that historical actors have sought to make and continues. So this is not to suggest that foreign audiences bought this argument uniformly. Interior technicians certainly encountered resistance to their interventions on the ground. And, one example, we can look at moments where mine workers were striking or other third world leaders were becoming more militant and seeking protections for their resources, as we see in the founding of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. In the case of Iran, there's also a kind of lovely story about the Yankee Go Home movement, where people started throwing rocks at the international development film wagons, the kind of motion picture educational wagons, when they tried to instruct them on things that included mineral resource utilization. So that said, interior officials were nevertheless responding to these challenges and thinking about other frontiers. And here's where I see then this move into the continental shelf as one example, the move to the final frontier of outer space as another kind of solution that they were bringing to the table. So I'll end the discussion on this whole development story by just carrying it forward to the 1960s briefly, where we see Udal as Interior Secretary listening to geologists still in the field, embedded in the field in international development in places like Minas Gerais in Brazil, saying we need help with our resource programs. And they called for a satellite that they thought could help sidestep some earthly resistance, a problem of access in the form of lacking infrastructure or perilous terrains, but also, as I see as being increasingly important, it moves things into a political terrain which helps to subvert or kind of circumvent the kind of sovereign protections that third world leaders were fighting so hard for at the United Nations and in other zones. Udal made this agenda, what would become the Landsat satellite, his own kind of bread and butter, sort of a show pony in his broader departmental activities. He said that these Earth resource satellites would help US modernizers and multinational firms view sites conducive to mineral extraction. He summarized the goal this way: if we don't find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, then we may someday spot it from the rainbow. He said that the satellite would literally prospect from the sky. So I want to end our discussion today by reflecting on how Interior Department's know-how and ideas about nature interacted with and collided with people on the ground, however briefly, because obviously I just gave a kind of satellite's eye view of the planners. I've talked a lot about what planners intended, but in the course of writing The Global Interior, I encountered vibrant movements that took on bold and transnational and controversial strategies to contest the inequitable terms of extraction. And this was evident in one pan-tribal coalition founded in 1975, the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, or CERT, or as they self-labeled with strategic intention, the Indian OPEC. So this coalition emerged in response to ongoing federal and corporate incursions on native lands that intensified in the wake of the energy crisis. A reminder that the US aimed tenaciously inward as well as outward in the 20th century. And people on this call, their work has shown this. I think Brian Frinner is here. So I am thinking about how these stories connect and how, as an onslaught of energy and mineral firms, including Amex and Exxon and others, sought mineral leases in the 1970s, the Indian OPEC saw a value in making claims to a transnational solidarity, to articulate their struggle in relation to foreign peoples who had also shared in a history of resource exploitation. It named and shamed the old Interior Department, as they said in their rhetoric, as the foremost agent of their exploitation. And this strategy is just a very important reminder of the ways in which many Native peoples refused to accept the terms of the US government and its corporate allies as they targeted mineral leasing opportunities. They tried to fight for a fairer distribution of the benefits alongside the tolls of mineral development. And this coalition was not without critics for embracing tenets of capitalism. And there's much more complicated history, but what stands out to me is the decidedly global view. It took on and challenging the seemingly neutral and apolitical narrative that the Interior Department had put forward. And that in turn, it helped to critically reframe American environmental management. This activism was a moment of transition in the Interior Department's own history as well. Social movements cast doubt on its legitimacy, and as federal funding was redirected in the Reagan years away from civilian entities to defense entities, the Interior Department had a very different kind of global portfolio. I see it as shrinking temporarily in ways that we can discuss. But I also think that such activism resonates with more contemporary efforts in environmental justice to build a more sustainable and equitable world. I realize that I've told a story that is really focused on state power and corporate allies. I'm very excited today to think along with activists across borders, racial lines, age brackets, and other categories of identity in the call for swift and bold action to address climate change. And I think that these histories are important. These histories are helpful in trying to understand the frequently occluded and often multiple origins of the climate crisis, one that is fossil fuel driven, but one where this proposed solutions also promise to be resource intensive, right? The green technologies herald other kinds of resource-based conflicts that could easily be replicated without giving pause to think about these histories. Expansion has often coincided with environmental management, and I saw this as being very important to US power in the 20th century, even as there is no doubt that environmental institutions have done so much good and that these are things that must be fought for. But it is also the case that their capacities to facilitate this push outward and to facilitate offshoring of ecological harm must also be addressed and disrupted. History might also point to important transnational strategies that used the framework of decolonization to challenge the asymmetries that were getting built into environmental management. And this is a conversation that I would say is all the more important, dare say, possible in this current context. At least I hope so. So I'll stop there, and I look forward very much to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. I was having some trouble unmuting. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone in the audience. We've got several options on how to proceed with questions. But first, I'd like to thank Dr. Tara Saunders, who's done so much to facilitate tonight's event. So I'd like to extend my thanks to Tara as well. All right, so to try to break out of the Zoom walls, one thing to do that, one way of going about that would be actually to ask questions, you know, turn on your camera and ask the question. And if you could just introduce yourself briefly, just again, to try to break out of these annoying little boxes. But you.
Oh, I think you've been muted temporarily, Fritz. You just went.
Sorry, did you get any of that?
We're breaking out of the boxes. And
yeah, to break out of the boxes, if you could just introduce yourself when you ask a question, or if you'd like to ask questions via chat, you're welcome to do that as well. Questions for Professor Black?
I have a question. I'll jump in. It's Micah Jorgensen. I am currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Stavanger, and it's midnight here and I'm in my PJs, so I'm not going to turn my camera on, but
that is tenacity. Thank you.
But I had to stay up late and listen to your talk. So I was just wondering if you talked a lot about the transnationalism of government and of the bureaucracy in your book and in your talk tonight, but obviously bureaucracies aren't the only players in extractive industry, and mining companies, extractive companies obviously play a really big role as well. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the internationalism of extractive corporations and how governments managed or dealt with them or worked with them or against them on that front.
Great question, Micah. Thank you for this, because I think it is a question that bothered me and that I saw different kind of highly contingent forms take. I mean, on some level, the internationalism of these corporations is as closely nested under and sometimes leading and sometimes following the sort of regulatory frame or the kind of government capacity frame that is expanding. But I was surprised to see some moments where extractive firms showed a kind of trepidation or nervousness around seeking overseas investment, understanding that there were risks involved. And so even the moment of international development, where we certainly know that the Seven Sisters, the oil companies, were hugely internationalist at this point and had been for decades. There were other kinds of extractive firms that were moving more slowly in that direction and claiming that they wanted situations where risk was mitigated. What did they want? They didn't want to worry about labor overseas. They didn't want to worry about high taxation. They didn't want to worry about expropriation, and especially in the wake of the Mexican expropriation of the petroleum industry, then the Mossadegh situation in Iran, that fear was pretty palpable among many companies. So I saw, for instance, a resource or a source in the Truman Library that really challenged my conceptions of the driving mechanisms. Involved surveys that had been sent to like the major commodities producers, asking them what they would like government to do for them overseas. And some of them were saying, you know, and this includes people like, or, you know, representatives of the DuPont company and Phelps Dodge and some of these others that were saying, you know, that yes, the incentives to overseas investment are nice, but they are dangerous, and we want, and kind of itemize that list. This is like on the survey, what I'm mentioning about taxation and labor. So so that's something that that I saw in that particular moment, even as we certainly have instances where it is the other way, where the US government is following in the path of extractive enterprises. So in Cuba, even in the 1898 moment, these companies like Bethlehem Steel already had a presence in foreign nations that the US then would develop a kind of sort of formal rule and then de facto rule over in subsequent decades. In other words, I think your question gets to the heart of this problem where I think both of these entities have expansionist mandates that function in tandem often. And I looking at the Interior Department, I see its role as an avid promoter of capitalism, but I also am trying to grapple with moments where they are in tension as well, and where their interests are not always perfectly aligned, including moments when the US helps to create markets, for example, in the trade of beryllium, which is something that they don't want sold on a free market because it is used in nuclear technologies. They want an exclusive arrangement where the US government is the buyer, and certain companies ended up being dissatisfied with that, you know, the kind of profit potential being different from what it might have otherwise been. So there's some nuance there that I've seen in different moments. I see John Larson waving his hand.
Thank you.
Megan, I must confess that when we were together in the Warren Center, I failed to appreciate how wonderfully radical the work you're doing is. You have shot an arrow into the heart of the innocence of the 21st century version of American exceptionalism, and I love it. You have put them right where they belong, and done so brilliantly. What I want to know is how can you drag the implications of what you've done for the 20th century into things like climate change and the resistance to any kind of international solution. Having, I think, successfully convicted the United States of its crimes right into the 21st century, how can we get people to recognize that this is not somebody else's problem?
Oh, John, thanks for that. I also want to thank you for, being an early Americanist on hand who could kind of help assuage some of the concerns that I had about trying to look back, and now you're asking me to look forward. So you are constantly challenging me to expand my periodization and temporal frame. The lessons here, I think, justly, questions of responsibility and distribution are being asked. It's part of the environmental justice frame, but it's also very important to the questions baked into sustainable development debates. And one thing that I've seen is that the United States had a pretty active hand in helping to offshore some of the dirtiest elements of industrialization. It was a joint corporate and state-led venture. And, not that there weren't frictions in that, but to kind of begin in a point where one sees the environmentalist concern justly being taken to the international community as a point of debate, it's very easy to point fingers, as has been the case of US officials, at industrializing nations, the terms that shift around that encapsulate nations in a global South frame. India, China are often pointed to, but there are stories behind this, and there are reasons that helps us, I think, to understand the claim that leaders were making, say in the Group of 77, in kind of a 70s and after frame, that the US and others were trying to take the ladder of development out from under them after deriving benefits from a fossil fuel-based economy and other things. I have not got the magical technical fix for that, because decarbonization is no doubt absolutely vital and necessary to planetary survival. But it is also the case that one can hardly imagine a kind of just and equitable framework for that process without understanding the myriad ways that there has been an offloading process, a kind of out of sight, like pushing out of sight into the edges, and that is also part of the story of environmentalism. How do we create a conservationist environmentalist frame that does not require the endangerment and harm of others? And how does that apply both within the United States? Because of course we know from great environmental justice work, many of these people are on this call, oh my goodness, Ellen Spears and others, that this is variegated within US borders and spread unevenly across populations, based on color, based on gender, based on many things. So history, I think, helps, if that can be a part of what the kind of reparations frame Laura Martin works on, restoration, what is a reparative kind of justice that could be applied to governance? I think that there aren't easy answers, but history is certainly part of the problem of why it's such an uneven field to begin with as a debate.
Thank you.
Yes, I see Canterbury has her hand up, and yes, I think I see a question from Michael. I'll try to weave in at some point as well.
Thanks so much for this. And also, I just want to say thanks both to Fritz and everybody at Purdue, and I see David Spatz on the call, and all y'all at ASEH who've made this specific talk work, and also this whole Environmental History Week experiment work. It's really super cool. So I'm thinking about how to understand and kind of what categories to put your arguments in my head. So I have a question about, I guess, substrate and substance.
Yeah. Okay.
Two sets of questions, and you can kind of deal with whichever ones you want. One is, how are your arguments about minerals and stuff that comes out of the ground like or unlike what you would argue about, or what you think others should argue about, stuff that was grown on the ground and organic things, and is it simply that nobody can write a history of everything, or is it that there is something different, right, about mineral extraction that you see as distinct from other ways in which American bureaucrats were surveying and scientizing and grabbing? And then I'm also wondering about what's different or same with this, our current kind of millionaire playboy driven effort to now do asteroid mining, right? And grab minerals from near Earth asteroids, or at least in theory. And if you think right there that I'm trying to get someone else to give me a way to wrap my head around space mining so that I can talk about it with my undergraduate classes, then you are exactly right. So that's I'm looking for a conceptual framework to understand this seemingly wacky stuff.
We all want to sit in on that class, so do let us know when it happens. Fabulous questions. This is something that on some level was a choice, where I see that, of course, Interior oversees a broader suite of resource agendas, then it is not reducible to minerals. Yet I often see a kind of braiding through where minerals are present in Bureau of Reclamation and national parks and Fish and Wildlife. There's contestations internally. They are not all uniformly agreeing with these kind of meso-level processes. But for me, I saw minerals being the thing around which Interior leaders, certainly like Ickes and Udal, made claims to the importance of their work, right? Understanding that legibility and power were much closer in proximity to something like mineral development than other kinds of resources. So Ickes self-anoints himself as petroleum czar and petroleum administrator for defense and petroleum administrator for war. And that became a kind of burden and problem for someone like Udal, who had, as we know, many kinds of environmentalist ways of thinking, a conservationist, an aesthetic, and a kind of more systemic view, but who nevertheless was constantly giving talks to the American Petroleum Institute and was working in a fossil fuel development that we see thanks to Andrew Needham's work. We could see how, they might, move away from water-based resources to the coal reserves on Navajo land as like the trade-off for the metropolitan growth in the American Southwest. But what I ultimately adhere to minerals for is, to me, they crystallize the contradiction of the claims to neutrality, in that this was a live wire. In 1930s, anti-imperialism is very clear, and not just the 1930s, but afterward, that mineral exploitation has just very clear associations with a highly uneven form of extractive capitalism. We could call it, like, people in the field of foreign relations would love to fight all day about whether we call that imperialism or whether it's a highly asymmetrical form of capitalism. But what it is something that historically is drawn on undeniably racialized labor regimes and this anxiety was very clear across many liberal or democratic administrations who had both sincere and conflicting desires to project a benevolent form of American power in the world. So for me, minerals kind of show this outer limit, even as their status as being finite helps to think about the harder work of repair afterward, in the wake of tailings and reclamation of those environmental zones or sacrifice zones. So that was partly a choice. I did see it having special power in Interior, and I did see, the Department of Agriculture making such more powerful claims to the things that grow that weren't sort of like rangelands and others. But I do see, unsurprisingly, that USDA is sharing in a desire to expand and taking on roles in foreign assistance, and the work on international development certainly shows good intentions and high modernist or community development based schemes around seeds that continue to miss the mark in really bringing about social improvement to foreign nations. The billionaire playboys question, which is the one everyone wants to talk about, I'm sure. I see that it is not just a kind of metaphor of the frontier just continuing out and spiraling in ways that, Cecil Rhodes said, expansion is everything. I would annex the planets if I could, but that there were very real skill sets embedded in that possibility. So the Bureau of Mines experimented, I'm not saying successfully, but they experimented on how to mine in zero gravity environments without surface water. They were aspiring to open the first extraterrestrial moon, not for economic development, that was insane at the moment, but for future kind of space exploration. So the idea that acetylene or other elements that they understood through remote sensing and other means to be in the kind of composition of the moon and lunar geology could be a basis for other kinds of space settlement fantasies, really, but also more so, more to the point, I think it was PR, like that they were doing this work maybe out of a curiosity, but also it was the moment where people were trying to sell space from Tang to other things. And I have certainly heard from geologist friends that and people who attend NASA meetings that, you know, now the moon mining is another thing that is trotted out, and it often just seems to coincide with the budgetary problem, right? Like, how do we justify the continued investment in something, even though many of us understand the scientific value? There are other pushes for the economic, and states have had an important hand in constructing the international legal regime that makes it technically viable to extract resources, even as my understanding as of a few years ago is that it's still not a very clearly defined activity in the global commons that is celestial bodies. And of course, the billionaire playboys rely on precisely that ambiguity of the legal regime, I think, as it has become a highly privatized endeavor, even though it is impossible to fathom that without the infrastructure that was publicly funded and brought to you by taxpayers across borders, because the US, India, and other nations have been very involved in this research. So thank you. Yes, okay, there's some things coming across over here. I don't know if anyone has a question. I see Michael Adamson is wondering about Interior's relationship with the World Bank and regional aid banks in the period of study. And I'll just kind of briefly say that there is a kind of broader ecology of institutions overseeing international development and projects across borders. And certainly the World Bank is, I see being especially important in like the 70s and after period, but is not one that I don't see a lot of meetings, for instance, between the World Bank and the Interior Department. Those often appear to be much more like State Department forward or other parts of the US government. But I'm learning more and more and from work wide ranging in foreign relations. Paul Adler has a new book coming out about this, and Quinn Slobodian's The Globalists, and others that kind of look at the finance part of the story. And I do hope to kind of understand that in my future work with greater nuance. So what I see is funding streams that are based in the US with kind of capitalist partnerships and local administrations. And you can imagine that there are elites across borders who are willing to partner and support different kinds of projects in international development, including mining projects that benefit them. So,
thanks.
Yes, I see Daniel, and then I think there are others with real hands. So Daniel has a blue hand. I might start there.
Thank you, Professor Black. Dan Schimmel, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Kansas. Thank you so much for the talk. And I guess I had a quick question. This is kind of a looking forward question instead of a looking back, which you know us historians love to do sometimes.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is coming off like the heels of Earth Day, and at the climate summit, a number of countries, even including China, were talking about the quote, like lost 4 years of the Trump administration changing policies from the Obama years. And a lot of these had to do with interior agencies and their policies. I mean, from your book, you lay out a number of, decades long initiatives that Interior carried out both domestically and internationally. And then you also mentioned this false binary between non-human nature being apolitical and then human nature being political. And of course, we can see the complications and just contradictions with that. So my question really gets to, in the hyper-politicized world that we now live in the 21st century in the United States, can Interior do the same kind of global work and have the same kind of global sway when initiatives and policies seem to be changing so drastically from one side of the pendulum to another, depending on the political parties that are controlling most likely the White House, but at times even the Senate and the House?
A big question and an important one. I am thinking about the kind of question about partisan politics backward as well, which might help us think forward, because it was certainly the case that there were different kinds of officials in power over the periodization of my book. We certainly see a different, more privatization-oriented and exploitation-oriented frame under Albert Fall, who is like famously part of the Teapot Dome scandal. And there were Republican and Democratic administrations in power over this period. I was surprised that even if whether the kind of privatization frame dominated or withdrawing public lands in a US context was kind of the major move in US Interior Department politics, they shared a kind of willingness to indulge the overseas investments, right? So that's something where I saw a lot of consonance across the administrations, whether it was Orme Lewis or Julius Krug or Cecil Andrus. The kind of exception, or the thing that is the most drastic that reminds me of the Trump years, is James Watt, who I think there are great kind of explorations of him in the context of like sagebrush rebellions and land use in the US. But his dream apparently, or it seemed, would have been to privatize all of the public domain and kind of dispense with the kind of estate that the Interior Department managed. That was too drastic. Nobody was happy with that. It cut into an array of Western interests, even as it certainly had supporters. And there are a lot of shared personnel, like Bernhardt and others are tied into some of the like Montana like law practices or advocacy groups, and that Watt had been a part of. I remember reading this at some point. I'm fuzzy on it because it's again kind of falling out of the book, but there is certainly a continuation of that drive. And I guess one kind of question is, am I calling for the abolition of the Interior Department? Like, is that what I get to at the end of the work? And the answer is no. Like, the fact is, in ways that other scholars are far better positioned to understand than myself, especially related to the special relationship between Native peoples and the federal government. What we saw with the Watt era is that trying to cut out government entirely also was incredibly destructive and wreaked havoc on the lives of many, many different Native peoples. And it's very complex issue. So like, part of what I rather would say is like disaggregating the kinds of capacities that are the extractive and that are the process of restitution, to kind of use David Troyer's framework in the recent piece in the Atlantic, that is about decolonization, that has, in my mind, a much better prospect if these can really be disaggregated. Now, it's exciting to think of Deb Haaland as somebody who has a expressed position, that is not just a normative de facto sort of embrace of the fossil fuel industry, that there can be a more meaningful disaggregation of these roles. But I would trust that that the people that she brings to the table to think about this would have a far better shot at achieving a better sort of a way of addressing this expansionist capacity and tendency than any administration that I can think of before this. It seems distinctive, even as I don't want to try to read the tea leaves, because we're in the early stages of this as well. So, thank you. And I think I have a question from, is it Will that is possibly, yeah, I think you're logged in. I've been given a tip that, yeah.
Yeah, it's a little confusing. We share a calendar, Margaret and I, and so whoever responds to the request ends up with our name on the screen. Hi, I'm Will Gray. I teach history at Purdue, and I do German foreign relations, so I do show up at Schaefer sometimes. And
oh, cool.
Yeah, I really like how the organization is moving and the Journal of Diplomatic History. Yeah, really, really exciting stuff for the last decade or so, I guess. And I'm doing a project now about Brazil and Germany, and that, of course, is a pretty extractive country in its own right. So in a way, what I'm curious about is how your project led you to interact with historians' national expertise. Because, you know, I'm sorry, Siri's trying to interrupt here.
Not now, Siri. We're talking about minerals.
Exactly. Don't get nervous. We're not going to recycle my computer yet. So, you know, I think that there's a tendency for historians to side with the nations that they study. So if it's Iran, oh my gosh, you know, Mossadegh all the way. I think it's a little easier to have distance when it's Brazil because, you know, we've seen what national sovereignty has done to protect natural resources in that country. But in a sense, do you find that when historians are kind of, you know, studying specific conflicts on the ground, you've got the transnational US corporations, that historians tend to reflexively side with the nations? And is that kind of problematic too? Like, is that a reflex that your work allows you to transcend? I guess in some ways, John Larson already anticipated this, but, you know, I guess in a practical way, do you find yourself having to resist almost every historian's angle in approaching this more globally?
Such, yeah, the national historiographies are ones that I made so many quick selections through, as you can imagine, given the lack of like a single area specialization. And you are so right to point out the incredible complexity when you kind of implicitly valorize a kind of project in, you know, the context of decolonization or third world leadership. And there are plenty of examples, you know, I'm like, Marcos is popping into my head, and Suharto, and like, there are plenty of figures that we might collectively turn to and think deeply and critically about. And the case that you're raising in particular is one that fits that mold too, where it's just so much more complicated. And I certainly appreciate the kind of the limitations to what I can say about, you know, like a prescription for what would have worked on the ground better, right? Or what would have the arrangement that greatest meets the autonomous desires of the majority of people in a given context, based on history and culture, geography, and all of these things. And certainly there are kind of patterns that one sees where it reminds how divisive mining activities and other kinds of activities are. But of course, that is the world in which we live, where all agents and actors who are complex and engaged in deep political debates are not going to agree uniformly on what is the proper linchpin of development and kind of economic subsistence or more than that, right? And adopting kind of capitalist methods. I saw that and learned that by trying to understand the politics of CERT, which itself, had, the Navajo Nation as one key member of that coalition had done surveys out of Shiprock asking people if they wanted coal development. And it was like 25% said this, 25% said this, like where it's like, yes, but, or no, definitely not, or no, except on, these conditions. There was a kind of tiered structure that showed that one cannot just try to make people, Richard White sometimes when he was reading my book, he's like, don't let people exist to resist, right? Like there's an assumption you can make that they are just oppositional and lacking their own kind of agential political desires. And yet one thing that I struggle with is the very clear like interventionist assumptions that the U.S. government made, and the sort of way in which it elicited an acknowledgement on their part that it wasn't even doing good by the standards that we continue to debate, right? Like whether that was a model for self-help, whether it was benevolent aid, whether it was unilateral ambition or multilateral, like were there missed multilateral solutions on the table? There's just a lot that wasn't thinkable because the assumption was that U.S. expertise was infallible and was missing in action beyond borders. So, but that's a good question and a tough one that gets also to the question I think John raised about what does the kind of international environmental governance structure do moving forward? How does it address these very important particularities? John is back at it.
Am I allowed a second comment?
I should think so. I think
I may have talked to you about this back at the Warren Center, but I'm often fond of quoting Walt Rostow and his famous non-communist manifesto in 1962, in which, among other things, and this is the period at which American exceptionalism remains perfectly innocent and unself-aware. And Rostow is arguing that it is the primary job of modernizers to disable the elites and the intellectuals of any culture that stands in the way of the kind of expropriation you're talking about. The arrogance and the supremacy buried in that kind of assumption is just breathtaking. And of course, your Stewart Udal pictures are in, slightly after, but roughly the same kind of cultural milieu. Within 10 or 15 years, particularly post-Vietnam, we've been forced, to wear a new costume. But I think Rostow is one of the best examples of the kind of mid to late 20th century assumption. We know it all.
Oh, Rostow, there's a great book by David Milne. I think it's subtitled, it's Walt Rostow, America's Rasputin. So I'll try and plug that. I'll also kind of use that as an opportunity to do a kind of comparative work that is under, I am unable to theorize it to its necessary extent, but to think about the Soviet model as like a counterpoint and what was going on as well with their own kind of development as part of a dueling modernisms or high modernist technical solutions in the Cold War competition. I've learned from other scholars that mineral developments were not absent of the Soviet frame, though they are often accredited with more of the infrastructure or the kinds of projects toward industrialization that many nations expressed a desire in, even as sometimes the United States would draw fire for failing to follow through on those kinds of activities relative to other projects that we know were about pacifying the peasants against a kind of communist revolution and so on. But the assumption Wow, how sure US officials were that they had something to offer that was superior is it's very consistent in the sources that I look at, which certainly have their perspectival limitations, but it was the case that the United States was incredibly confident that it could develop the chromium deposits of the Logar province of Afghanistan in the 1950s. They could do that better than anybody else possibly could. And yet in 2005, they would need to do it again, seemingly without any awareness that US officials, US Geological Survey people had been there before for precisely the same reason, after the global war on terror opened up a new set of conditions by which the US Interior Department followed the Army, as it had done before, in surveying and trying to, as they were very proud to put it, open up a new kind of resource potential with an estimated, multiple trillions of dollars worth of return, and that these are not separate from now lithium and other technologies we understand to be important to green technologies. So I think that there are, thankfully, I see at MIT too, that students are asking much tougher questions, are being asked tough questions about the kind of faith in the frame, or like the singularity of a frame by which one makes decisions, and the idea that knowledge, there are local knowledges that are that cannot be understood as anti-modern, that are deeply modern, but that fall outside of the frame of what the U.S. and other institutions have often claimed to be valid. So one point that surfaces in many readings, but it's on my mind because it's from last week, is the Troyer piece, which calls to mind the fact that now the experts are turning to indigenous knowledge and genealogical knowledge, things that have been since time immemorial, important aspects of custodianship of land and water and non-human nature and the like. Nick Estes and others Dina Gilio-Whitaker have really brought an indigenous and environmental justice frame that is, it seems, much more widespread in its kind of legibility, and that is something that calls to mind the many and multiple knowledge regimes that exist or that are possible. And so I think that the kind of humility that is absent in something like a Rostov figure, and even in some US experts as late as 2005, 6, and 7 in Afghanistan, is hopefully evident in more technical experts and US officials and everyday folks than was certainly the case in the Cold War. Philip, I think I see, and then Max. And Max, you have a great point about Neil Maher's Apollo in the Age of Aquarius, which is a fabulous book also. So maybe we'll start with Philip and get to you, Max.
Hi, so I'm Philip Vogelweed. I'm second year MA student here at Purdue. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for the book and also for the presentation, because it's has a lot of overlap with some of the research that I've been doing. I work in, right now it's environmental and agricultural history. So it's a lot of looking at the USDA and that organization, which I thought there was a lot of crossover between your book and the history of the USA as well, or USDA as well. Mm-hmm. And so I guess, I'm looking forward, towards doing a larger project, and I'm curious, what your journey was in archives, what kind of fun stories came up, but where, you found the archives for these, the Interior Department themselves, like where did you have to travel to, where did you find them? Because I've found that US aid has come up a lot in like 1980s politics, particularly surrounding agriculture, and I'm interested in following that line of thinking.
Great. Oh, I'm excited about this project. It sounds great. I want to know about what is that? The post-Butts, the Earl Butts USDA, and so many transformations in the 1970s. So I would say that I was very lucky about the kind of time when foreign assistance agencies files in the National Archives were becoming very, very like widely available. They were not very always so nicely organized, but it's partly because there are so many categories. Like this is something where, you know, if the usual categories, I think that the diplomatic historians that tend to run the foreign assistance agencies are dealing with are totally different in when these other bureaucracies are kind of central to them. So, but I looked across country mission files. I was always looking for minerals, but of course there were biological resources that I kind of selected out, and you know that's a part of the story that's not central to my own, and water resources and others can be clear. And I mentioned like the desalination and other projects that Udal oversaw, and I don't mean to minimize those or suggest that those are apolitical either. I kind of set it up as like, oh, but mineral interests, but those are just like the ones that people were pretty clear on were deeply political even then, and it was a key point of activism, and certainly others that in that moment were dubious. But from there, interior personnel, especially secretaries of the interior, were key repositories. Many of them were at the Library of Congress. So Julius Krug is one example. I went to see the Udal papers. I saw Harold Ickey's papers, Oscar Chapman, and many others. And some of those were also files that were relevant were in presidential libraries across administrations. Hathi Trust has a lot of government reports, and these are important for our current moment where we're mobilized, right? So the kind of government reports are a useful part, but they are also, you know, one part. So I was often trying to find the correspondence behind the report to get at things. But a kind of cool story, I appreciate that you understood that looking at Interior Department files at all was fun at any point in the whole process. But there was one moment at the University of Utah where I went to see what I thought was just one report by a U.S. Geological Survey man named Eugene Callahan. And it turned out that all of his reports were there. And these are a very rare example, in my understanding, a rare example of when U.S. Geological Survey reports were classified or were never published because they were deemed too sensitive because it dealt with tin in Bolivia. So in my understanding, as I sat down, it was much more revealing than I expected because there were more reports than anticipated. But it allowed me a window onto something that even the state had effaced, right? So even though we understand state power to be transparent in many ways, there are corners certainly where it is not. And yeah, so those were major ones. You'll notice those are U.S. National Archives in a lot of ways, and the state actors. And I tried my best to kind of broaden that out in other chapters and looking at news media, and there were many files like pamphlets. The public-facing side of the Council of Energy Resource Tribes were available at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania with kind of ambivalent ties to the Indian rights organization. And so, yeah, I bounced around and I found some things, and there are so many things that were not found, which I think is the cool part, knowing there's ongoing work. And I would love to know more about the USDA's part in all of it as well. So Max, I think we still have time. I'm just going to keep going until somebody gives me the shepherd's hook here. So you still have your question, Max?
Yeah, I'm sorry to go on too long. So I'm a graduate student at Brown University in history, and I've really enjoyed your talk and the parts of your book I've read thus far, and particularly as someone interested in the 19th century U.S. history, I'm very happy to see how you broaden it out. And I think it seems to join some work by other people in the past 6-7 years, like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and Catherine Bjork, and Manu Karuka, in kind of broadening this history of US empire and colonialism to North America as well. And I'm wondering, as someone who's kind of recently kind of coming to the field of US empire, what this kind of state of the field is, I guess, in addressing kind of US settler colonialism, because I feel like it does often still kind of surprise me when I read kind of broad essays on US empire, still the kind of lack of attention to 18th and 19th century settler colonialism and this kind of post 1898 conceptualization that still seems pretty common to me. So I'm just wondering how that kind of work has been received, where the field is in terms of those connections and conceptualizations.
Oh my, so important. I think that there has been such a dearth of scholarship that explicitly has hailed itself as foreign relations history. And this is the infuriating part about it, where I understand that part of what I learned and continue to learn is that, of course, this foreign relations history has been written with incredible nuance. It's just that it's appearing at other conferences and other journals. It's NASA, it's early American history, and that it feels like that, part of what I assumed was that, that scholarship is fantastic and rich and doing all of the kind of work of showing negotiation and war and violence, but also, other ways of understanding agency and colliding sovereignties. But in the kind of Schaefer world, I'll call it the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, they had such a 20th century slant to the stories that they told that now they are grappling with and having an aha moment, even as it is the case that, there's so much more work to be done. Emily Conroy Krutz is somebody who's looking at kind of missionary networks in the kind of 19th century moment. And she's somebody who also leads SHEAR meetings. And I just think that it would be amazing to see more of this conversation, even as I have seen people like Brian DeLay and Alexander Harmon and others debate in these great forums about, what is the usefulness of settler colonialism as a frame? Is it too totalizing? Does it perpetuate this kind of telos that, especially among foreign relations folks, can easily sort of repeat this false understanding of disappearance, vanishing, erasure, or that there was no outside or contestation, negotiation, refusal, strategic incorporation, adaptation, and the like. So I would love to see basically people learning foreign relations to just have to read other journals than the ones that we have and learn more from scholars who have done this work, and just realize that we've made a mistake by accepting the actors categories that have challenged sovereignty in continental and other kinds of contexts. And I think there will be more work that does this. And I think it can't come soon enough. So I hope that your work continues to do that, and that the foreign relations history takes some of the things it does well, which is attend to power and projection and the mechanisms by which US actors and institutions and ideas have infiltrated other historically situated contexts, but to do so in a way that that allows for a greater variety of actors and institutions and ideas to be on the field. So it's an ongoing process. Brian, can I see you?
Oh, hi, Megan.
Yes, hi.
I've been listening to your talk and been trying to think about how to formulate this question. And so the question is, so foreign relations, diplomatic history is really not my thing, but I've recently begun kind of getting into a second oil project framed roughly 1900 to 1945.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that in your work is definitely very helpful to think about framing this, particularly when it comes to ideas of American exceptionalism.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I've been wondering about, and I'm wondering if you can speak to, is the comment was made earlier, Walter Rostow, it was still the innocent stage of American exceptionalism. And I'm wondering, in the pre-World War II era, I see the same kinds of statements about American exceptionalism with regard to the oil industry as exist kind of on steroids in the post-World War II era. And I'm just wondering, is it, if American exceptionalism is kind of so elastic and so useful to explain American expansion so consistently, is there any point at which it kind of stops being useful as a way to explain what US mineral and or oil industries are doing in terms of growing these economies of scale? Does that make sense?
Oh, it does, and it's such a tough one to kind of get even a kind of starting kind of traction to respond to, in part because it's so central to the study of U.S. empire, and at the same time, its explanatory power is in many ways about what it makes invisible and what it effaces and what it conceals, or this insistence that the United States, among other ways we can think of exceptionalism, that its anti-colonial origins, which of course, to utter that phrase with a straight face, one must efface and disregard all of the settler colonial context by which U.S. nation building took place. It was expansion from the get-go. But the kind of myth of anti-colonial origins is one that has often allowed for the continued expansion under the guise of a kind of moral mandate, and where I certainly have seen the kind of powers of exceptionalism at place as, I mean, it doesn't belong in just one arena. I think that's maybe what your point is getting to, that it can exist as something that is nested so easily under the frontier myth that is so complex and so overwrought, but also in the kind of narrative of US abundance, its natural endowment, and thinking about, like figures in the early 20th century who were convinced that what differentiated the United States was not only anti-colonialism, but the fact that it's tied to it, the idea that unlike Europe, which had, these tiny borders that were stunting its development, the US had like such a vast endowment of natural resources. Of course, that participates in the same erasure, even as it is an early example of things that I've focused on, where by attending to the natural resource, and there are great scholars who call into question, like calling it a resource, we need to put it in scare quotes, right? But like the non-human nature becomes the canvas on which these desires for expansion are projected. So I think that it's still worth understanding the specificity and attending to the moments where these erasures are taking place. I came to see the Interior Department in its very naming and in its story that it told itself as a key institutionalizing of exceptionalism, because if it was the Department of the Interior, then it presumed that it wasn't the Department of the Exterior, and it from the get-go internalized or sought to domesticate that which, as we know, was had alternates, like other sovereignties, foreign sovereignties, whether indigenous nations or Mexico and New Spain or whatever they might have been, that that it had to deny in order to say with a straight face. I feel like this is such a good and important question, though, because it is so mutable and so far-reaching. I love your point about periodization too, because I agree it isn't not just a post-war phenomenon, even as, you know, some put it in, you know, 1630 and the city on the hill, and some people put it like where are the kind of parameters that make exceptionalism meaningful. But you're making me think that when we say we're talking about exceptionalism, we need to be really clear about what pillars, or like what genre perhaps, or what are the kinds of other I want to say like a taxonomy of American exceptionalism that doesn't assume that just saying it makes it scrutable and clear what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I'll stop talking, but I mean, it's helpful to hear you talk through this, because I mean, I keep seeing it within the context of World War I and World War II, and that seems to me to be dramatically different than the whole global era Cold War era application of it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really, I'm excited, super excited to learn more, Brian, and talk more about that, because yeah, like there's so many different things as I've been teaching this semester and dealing more with that time period, or, you know, just like preparing the lecture notes, you're like, wait, what are the differences between this internationalism and then what happens after in 1945, right? There are echoes, but there are real peculiarities tied to, you know, events in Europe and its own kind of colonial reaches. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to more conversations about that. So thank you. Yes, Fritz.
So let's see. So you began the talk with that wonderful vignette about Stewart Udal, who on the one hand, you know, wearing his bolo tie and wants to present this figure of aw shucks, folksiness, while at the same time clearly wielding the full weight of American soft power in negotiating mineral rights. And at other points in the book, you show how, you know, Udal was in some sense, well, in a very real sense, complicit with the oil leases that facilitated the Santa Barbara oil spill. But I'd like you to help me reconcile that Udal, or those Udals, with the Udal who wrote The Quiet Crisis a year after Silent Spring, with a very similar sort of popular response, you know, among Americans.
Yeah, the many faces of Stewart Udal, or I really do think this article would be wonderful for somebody to write it. There's part of me that wants to do the deep dive and do the work to be able to write it. The Quiet Crisis is such an important text, and one that I've seen interpreted justly in the framework of like neo-Malthusianism and a very population-centered concerns. And you can see his very global frame even in The Quiet Crisis, which is often, you know, we see it as like this kind of input on the path to the Wilderness Act, you know, and things that are part of environmental legislation that are important, and I don't mean to minimize, but I think that part of what I see is that, you know, the assumptions about population that are sometimes explicit and sometimes a little bit more concealed in the ways that are similar to like Paul Ehrlich. Udal isn't exceptional in that regard. He's kind of a part of a broader moment that was thinking about, you know, the kind of ecological frame, but one that was really focused on limits and carrying capacity and then the kind of if Laura Martin's still on this call, I love, she kind of refers to it as like the apocalyptic version of the environmentalist thinkers. And I think that some of those assumptions about people help to understand, and the fact that it is globally framed, help to understand the part of his politics that could willingly offshore it, literally, like on the continental shelf, like you're kind of hinting at there, but also to foreign nations. I think that many people were able to think that, you know, maybe with a parceling logic of like, if we rationally plan to put something here, then it will, you know, by the power of the lines we draw on the map, not be a problem that materializes elsewhere. So here I think about, you know, he was operating in a moment where the carbon emissions report in '65 was making clear that, you know, there is a transborder crisis in something like oil combustion and fossil fuel combustion. In the same way, he was getting reports later, this is all after the quiet crisis in like '67, about the Torrey Canyon oil spill. And he understood that it is possible for there to be devastating ecological consequences tied to extractive ambitions. But I think that he is not alone in being able to parse and see the kind of utilitarian stream of his environmentalism take precedence over the systemic environmentalism, and the aesthetic is one that could sometimes incentivize the turn to the utilitarian or the kind of willingness to extract fossil fuels. This, you know, I'm going to turn again to Andrew Needham's work, which showed that like he sided with the Sierra Club and others to protect the scenic beauty of like water resources that might have been a part of the story of Los Angeles's power source. But in doing that required then saying, okay, well, the coal and Navajo reservation is what shall be exploited. So more time needs to be spent with Stewart Udal, and someone better equipped than I needs to write the story about how his family and the Romney family and the family of Barry Goldwater are actually like really linked back into like a 19th century story of, you know, the Mormon Trail and after. So there's stuff there, Fritz, and I'm very curious about it myself.
Could I just tack on Anne Gorsuch Burford and her son Neil as well? Just thinking about families that wield power.
Yes, and Western politics is, I think, one of those that you miss the dynasty part of it, even as you know, to like track with some other, like the Kennedy to Bush and others, but there are important and intergenerational things going on that that would make for a great dissertation.
It does occur to me that I had one job in tonight's proceedings, and that was to keep track of the time. So I have failed miserably in that task. Having said that, I don't get the sense that anyone who's still with us is complaining, but I do just want to thank Megan Black again for a wonderful talk and a wonderful book. And it's really been a pleasure to have this discussion. And at the same time, I don't want to cut it off now. If there are still questions and if you're still feeling energetic and able to continue, that would be great.
Well, as I'm seeing, David, I want to go back then to the settler colonial question too, because there are global comparative histories of settler colonialism that I think are very robust at Schaeffer. David, I'd be curious to know, what's your analysis of Schaeffer, to kind of go back to, I know Max left the call, but yeah, what do you think is the direction?
No, I thought your assessment was correct in that it's focused way too much on 20th century issues and post 45 issues.
Yeah.
It's changing. I agree that it's changing, but the 19th century remains woefully understudied, and you know, I think Schaefer's transformed dramatically in the past 10 years in terms of the people that are involved and therefore the issues that are being studied. But it's still rooted in the 20th century, and I think there's a great deal to learn from the 19th. I agree.
Yeah, and there are works that defy that, thankfully, and we can turn to them for the enrichment of our brains and our souls. So it was so wonderful to be in this great company. I've learned a lot from this group, both before this meeting and after it. I feel like I'm going to be just kind of swimming with thoughts and questions and ideas for a while.
Well,
Well, it's it's an amazing book, Megan. It really is tremendous.
Oh, David, thank you so much. Well, we have lots of conversations to have at conferences and the like for many years to come. So,
well, thanks. Are there any final questions? It sounds like Professor Black is open to emails, so please follow up, and who knows, perhaps opportunities to actually meet at physical conferences will be possible in the near-term future.
Oh, such a warm thought. I am looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to that hotel bar in the future. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you again.
Yes. Have a happy weekend.
Thanks, Megan.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Good night.
Thanks, Fritz, for your organizing, and Tara.
Yes.
That was fun.
Yes,
Thanks,
Tara,
Dave.
thank you so much. I meant to say thank you earlier and forgot, so I'm sorry.
Come and say hello and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
You're so welcome. Take care.
Thank you. Oh.